Hello, friends. It's Bradley J, and we are live on the broadcast here with Rich Rubino, who is an author and a political expert, like crazy smart at political history. Got a bunch of books. One of them is The Great American Political Trivia Challenge. What's the subtitle of that?
Political trivia on steroids.
Right. So we're going to talk today about some humorous stuff that happened on campaign trails in the past and how campaigns these days are different or the same than they used to be. So welcome to the show. You look great.
Thank you so much, Bradley. Glad to be here again.
Absolutely. Before we get started, what are your other books and where can you get them?
Yep, you can get them all on Amazon.com. The first one is the Political Bible of Little Known Facts in American Politics. The second is the Political Bible of Humorous Quotations in American Politics. The third is Make Every Vote Equal, What a Novel Idea. The fourth is American Politics on the Rocks. And the fifth is the Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids.
Where, how do you crank those books out so quickly?
It's a very maniacal interest, if you will. It takes about 2 years, and obviously there's a little bit of overlap, and so much of it is just trying to think that what you already know, and it's a matter of trying to verify. And then when you find one thing, you find 7 or 8 other things, and you say, wow, that's fascinating. And then half the time you find stuff that you think is true, and it's not true, like Everett Dirksen, the Senate Minority Leader from Illinois, supposedly said $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about some real money. So I went to try to verify that, and I found out that some guy sat next to him on an airplane and said, that's a really good quote you said. And Dirksen looked at him and says, oh, no, I never actually said that. I just never bothered to deny because it was such a darn good quote. So you go into this just rabbit hole and just keep going and going and going.
But not everybody's as into it as you are. How did you get so into it? When and how?
I'm a freak, I guess. I guess it was just an interest growing up. I had this interest that C-SPAN came to my municipality. I started watching C-SPAN, and I just couldn't really stop. And it was just this gravitational pull down that rabbit hole of trying to find as much information as I can about presidents, congressmen, senators, governors, Supreme Court justices. But it is very much kind of a niche market, and why people get interested in what they get interested in. It's interesting what kind of effectuates that. But I think a lot of it was just reading books about presidents, and I think watching C-SPAN as a youngin', I guess.
Having studied it so much, in your opinion, what percent of people in the legislative branch and the executive branch are there to serve us, and how many are there to serve themselves?
Well, it's different. I think that a lot of it is more nuanced. I would say that there are a lot of them who basically want to serve a lot of people, including themselves. Sometimes the politicians that get involved in graft and get involved in corruption are also the ones that do the most for their constituents, because obviously they kind of know where the bodies are buried, if you will, and they know what lever to push. But my guess is, I don't think that you can necessarily say that it's one or the other. Now, obviously, there are some that get in there and their entire objective is good government, clean government. And there are others that are there and their entire objective is simply to gain as much for themselves and their coefficients. But generally speaking, I think most people, like in everything else in every aspect of life, are somewhere in the middle there. I think most of them actually, I think, come with good intentions. But once you get in there, self-preservation, I think, is the first rule of human nature. So people immediately say, either how am I going to continue in this job, or how am I going to move up? So immediately they say, this is what I have to do to get to here. This is what I have to do to get to there. And it gets to the point where it just becomes a matter of getting from point A to point B, rather than having some sort of an ideological struggle, or rather than getting in there because, you want for a 10-year project to clean the river in New Bedford or whatever it is. But I think that for the most part, it's very, it sounds like a political answer, but it's very nuanced. But if you want a percentage, I would say 53% are honest.
What are the Democrats doing wrong, and what are the Republicans doing wrong? On the Republican side, you have to ask, is the Trump devotion going to hurt them or help them? The candidates that take that Trump road, does that hurt them or help them? And what are the Democrats doing wrong? Are they are they concentrating on niche topics, niche issues that are hurting them, and at the expense of the big picture? What are both sides doing wrong? What's each side doing wrong?
Yeah, on the Republican Party, certainly if you come from a predominantly And the way the districts have been gerrymandered, there are very few marginal districts, meaning that there is a moderate Democrat or a moderate Republican representing a district that is essentially about half Trump, half Biden. But right now, generally speaking, I think the Republican Party, it has essentially become the party of Donald Trump. He's completely changed the way conservatism and Republicans are supposed to think. But for every president, basically from Eisenhower to George W. Bush, were an interventionist in foreign policy. They wanted more liberal more liberal trade laws. I mean, it was the Republicans that got through NAFTA, for example. George H.W. Bush got the Central America Free Trade Agreement through. And then in terms of immigration, they all wanted more liberal immigration laws. Donald Trump has completely changed that. He's changed the master narrative. Now, anybody who essentially who held the ideology of the Republican Party prior to Trump is considered a rhino or Republican in name only. And obviously, a lot of the people who are Trump Republicans come from congressional districts and Senate seats that are very safe. So for them, it's in their best interest to essentially adhere and genuflect to Trump as much as possible. But that being said, where it actually matters in terms of marginal districts, in terms of Senate seats that are very competitive, Donald Trump, he's somebody who's never garnered 50% of the vote, and he's never actually won the popular vote. So that has deleterious effects on them. But it's a delicate balancing act, because on the one hand, you do not want to alienate Donald Trump unless you're running as a completely anti-Trump Republican. And by the way, a lot of those who run as anti-Trump Republicans who voted for the impeachment are not running for re-election right now. Fred Upton of Michigan, for example, Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, Liz Cheney is probably one of the last ones in Wyoming who did vote for the impeachment. And now Trump, Kevin McCarthy, and the entire Republican intelligentsia, the infrastructure, is coming to Wyoming to essentially campaign against her. I'm very interested, though, where Trumpism goes after Donald Trump. Donald Trump will not be there perpetually. So when Donald Trump egresses from the political stage, will the party kind of revert back to where they were prior to Donald Trump? Or has Donald Trump defined what the ideology of the Republican Party is? Essentially, what Donald Trump is, he's where the Republican Party was from Warren G. Harding to Herbert Hoover from 1921 to 1933, at least less interventionist in foreign affairs, economic nationalist in terms of free trade, wanting more tariffs, for example, and wanting to not only curtail legal immigration and obviously to liquidate illegal immigration. So that's kind of where the party is. On the Democratic side, it's interesting because Joe Biden does not effectuate the love that Donald Trump does. A lot of people voted for Joe Biden simply because they thought that he was electable. They thought that he was the only candidate in the general election that could appeal to, for example, blue collar voters in places like in essentially the Rust Belt in Pennsylvania, in Ohio. And they were probably right in that respect, but he's never really been a base candidate. Very similar, I think, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton were never candidates that really rallied the bases of their party, but there are candidates who are electable. So that being said, there is not necessarily a real loyalty toward Joe Biden, and any candidate who's kind of recreant or goes against what Joe Biden stands for in terms of as a Democrat, it actually in many respects helps them. In some respects, because the left wing of the Democratic Party, I think, feels disenchanted. There's a lot of talk about if Joe Biden does run in 2024, having a challenger for him from the left wing, the way Jimmy Carter had Jerry Brown and Ted Kennedy back in 1980. Ro Khanna from the congressman is one person are considering. So I think the Democratic Party has a little bit more leeway to run essentially against some of Joe Biden's policies that don't necessarily fit well. They don't fit well in their districts or in their states. But there are very few districts that are actually competitive right now. And most candidates, the biggest fear they have is not from somebody from the other party. It's from somebody from their right or their left running in the primary against them, saying that they are too moderate. So we're at this point now where we're being as extreme as possible actually helps you politically.
If that's the case, then AOC would have a shot at some point, right?
Well, the problem with AOC is she comes from a predominantly Democratic district. And the reason she won her seat in the first place, Congressman Crowley, well, part of it was he was spending an inordinate amount of time outside the district campaigning for other people because he essentially wanted to be Nancy Pelosi's successor when she's no longer speaker, but also because he was seen as too moderate for that congressional district. The problem with AOC is if she were ever to run nationally, I don't see where she necessarily garners support other than from the left wing of the Democratic Party. For example, is there anyone either in the center or somebody who potentially is a weak Donald Trump voter that'll potentially go over to AOC? The problem with her is she's been stationed, if you will. She's been put in this kind of ideological box where it's very hard for her to move to the center. Now, that being said, there was some talk this past year, and she declined to do it. There were some on the left who did not like Chuck Schumer, who wanted her to challenge Chuck Schumer. She did not do that. But she's a fascinating phenomenon, just like Donald Trump, because this is somebody who was as a freshman member of the United States House of Representatives, who was now she's a sophomore. She was not a chairman of a subcommittee, not a chairman of a committee, not a member of leadership. But if you look at the attention she garners simply from the media, it is really kind of overwhelming. But her actual power in the United States Congress is essentially she's a sophomore member of the United States Congress, and she's not in a leadership position.
Why did she get so much attention? And how much of that attention was because she was, according to Western standards, attractive?
I think that was part of it. I also think, though, it was because she was such a shock personality, and because that was an election that was on very few people's radar. Congressman Crowley, who was the chairman, he was the chairman of the Democratic caucus, basically, which is third in line of leadership. And he was seen as a successor for Nancy Pelosi. And he literally would send surrogates to debate AOC because he viewed her as just kind of a nuisance or a menial task to actually have to run against her. He didn't really wage much of a campaign. And all of a sudden, she wins a primary. Now, you win a primary in that congressional district, it's tantamount to winning the general election, because if whoever the Republicans are going to put up is lucky to get 20%. But so she goes on. And I think part of it, the fact that she was so young, the fact that she really came out of nowhere, the fact that she was such a different voice in the Democratic Party. I think particularly the Bernie Sanders bloodline of the party, she was seen as kind of the heir apparent to that. But it's still, a lot of it was the media's doing. Just like, for example, on the right, Marjorie Taylor Greene, very similar. She's still a freshman member of the United States House of Representatives. She's not in leadership. She's not even on a committee now, but she's certainly not a chairman of a subcommittee or a committee. So her actual power in terms of getting legislation through is very limited, but she's a very attractive personality, and she's someone who's very good for sound bites. And that's why I think the media is kind of drawn to people like both of them on the left and the right of the spectrum.
The social media algorithms favor the shock, favor the
absolutely.
extreme.
Absolutely.
Do these candidates play to that? Do they say wild stuff for the social media algorithms?
I don't think so, because if you listen to what, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene was saying prior to becoming a member of Congress, when, for example, the supporting the QAnon supposition, I actually think she's actually moderated herself to the point that she can since she's been in terms of AOC. She's essentially saying what she has always said. She was a Bernie Sanders supporter. She was a Democratic socialist. She's right in line essentially with that. But it is true that, you very rarely hear riots of moderates. You very rarely hear moderates protesting, storming the Bastille. The people that, generally speaking, that make the most noise are usually those that are on the right or that are on the left. And obviously the media will be attracted in order to transmit information to the people who are saying the things that are the most interesting for their viewers, for their readers, for the respective listeners. And I think that people, it's interesting. I will say this, though, in terms of the United States Congress, I think the most effective members of Congress are probably the ones you never hear of. They usually get, for example, you get on the Appropriations Committee, you get very little national attention, but you can do a lot for your congressional district. You can do a lot in terms of bringing appropriations, bringing earmarks to your district, to your state, but you don't get much national attention. If you want to get national attention, you're going to be on the Foreign Relations Committee, you're going to be on the Armed Services Committee, maybe the Financial Services Committee, and you're going to be spending a lot of time tweeting. And every time something in the news happens, you're in there tweeting, you're going after your opponents. And as a result, the media is attracted to that. They're not necessarily attracted to somebody who's trying to get the farm bill through the Agriculture Committee, for example.
Back to Biden. Do you think he'll run again? He doesn't. I wouldn't if I were him. Let's put it that way. If he feels the way he looks, if I felt the way he looks, I would not run. On the other hand, there are no charismatic stars really. There's nobody after him. His vice president doesn't seem like she's got a lot of juice. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't think he's going to run ultimately. Konrad Adenauer in Germany is really the only leader I can think of who was older, who was effective. I think that he's going to you have to, in order not to be seen as a lame duck. Once you're a lame duck and everyone in Congress thinks that you're only going to be there for a year or two, it's very hard to get your legislative program through. Accordingly, it's in his best interest to, as much as possible, for as long as possible, to say that he's going to run.
Right.
My guess is he's probably, but on the other side of that, you also, if there's going to be a primary next year, a lot of candidates are not going to run against an incumbent president. So it's in your interest to give respect to them so that they can raise money. They can go to Iowa. They can go to New Hampshire. They can go to South Carolina. My guess is he's probably going to say throughout the midterm elections, which he's saying right now, that he is going to run. And he'll probably make his official decision probably February or March. I think he'll do the same thing Lyndon Johnson did in 1968, basically saying that there are so many issues he has to deal with in Lyndon Johnson's case, in terms of Vietnam, in terms of the social unrest, that he can't spend any time worrying about partisan political causes. Therefore, he won't seek his party's nomination. That's my guess. What Joe Biden will say, he'll say that the presidency is such an awesome job. There's so much going on right now internationally, domestically, so he won't be able to spend as much any time on the campaign trail. In which case, you have a complete free-for-all. Vice President Kamala Harris is a very weak vice president in many respects politically, because when she ran herself, she did not get to Iowa. She was at about 2% in the polls. By weak, what I mean is she does not have a groundswell of support for her, and there's not necessarily a constituency that I would call the Vice President Harris constituency. But that, and also her record as a prosecutor in California, there are a lot of questions, particularly many on the left, who have about her prosecution of marijuana offenders, which is something that would really can really offend a lot of people on the left wing of the Democratic Party. But she has almost ecumenical name recognition, so that's certainly a benefit. If it's going to be a crowded primary, everyone from, I think, Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, is certainly in the offing. You can go to the governors. I think Ray Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, would be a very formidable candidate. The problem he has is, in North Carolina law, when the governor is out of state and the lieutenant governor becomes governor, and in North Carolina, the lieutenant governor is a Republican. So accordingly, every time Cooper would be out campaigning, he's, by the way, probably the quintessential moderate Democrat, somebody who I think would be very electable in the general election. But every time he's out campaigning, the Republican becomes governor of North Carolina. So he's in a very precarious position. And if he resigns as governor, then a Republican becomes governor. Becomes governor of North Carolina. So there's going to be I would at least say 6 or 7 major candidates, probably about 17 or 18, if you will, candidates. Some of them might be vanity candidates. Some of them might be members of Congress who are trying to garner as much name recognition or perhaps meet donors. And then you can then use that money if they're going to run in the state run, or if they're going to run for senator, if they're going to run for governor. I think Ro Khanna from California is going to probably be the candidate of the Bernie Sanders wing. Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts says she's running for re-election. My guess is she probably will run for re-election, but she's certainly somebody that's certainly an option as a presidential contender. I think Abby Klobuchar will try to run for that kind of center lane, if you will. Now, if Joe Biden does run, I do think that, just like Jimmy Carter, there is going to be a challenge from the left wing of the party, probably somebody from the Progressive Caucus who thinks that Joe Biden has been too accommodationist, too moderate. I don't think he's going to do what Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were able to do, and George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan on the Republican side, which is essentially to win their nomination with very nominal opposition.
What's the problem with Joe Biden? Why are his numbers so low? Is it simply inflation, or it's just that?
No, I don't think it's just inflation. I think that, first of all, part of it is simply the times. And generally speaking, in the first 2 years of a presidency, the incumbent president loses a lot of support. Generally speaking, a party loses about 39 seats in the House of Representatives in that first midterm election. Ronald Reagan lost 26 seats, and there were certainly many economic problems in 1981 when Ronald Reagan cut taxes. Then he had to come back the next year. He had to sign the Tax Equity Act of 1982, which raised taxes. In 1982, He was people did not like the situation economically, and Ronald Reagan loses 26 seats, but he comes back 2 years later and wins 49 states. The presidential race in '84. Bill Clinton loses 52 seats in the House of Representatives, 1994. Very similar. The economic recovery was very de minimis, very slow. People were blaming Bill Clinton, but he came back in 1996 and he won 49% of the vote. Barack Obama in the first 2 years was relatively unpopular. I think the Affordable Care Act was not popular. He lost 63 seats in the House of Representatives in 2010, but he came back in 2012 and won relatively comfortably. So the fact that Joe Biden is likely to lose seats in the House, and the fact that his job approval rating is well under 50%, is not necessarily a precursor to what could happen to him electorally. Part of it is, where will the economy be in 2023? Where will it be in 2024? Obviously, people view the president as having plenipotentiary powers, and generally, if whatever the state of the economy, they immediately pin on whoever the incumbent president is. George H.W. Bush certainly saw this in 1992, for example. He had a 91% job approval rating after the Gulf War, went down to 38% in 1992, and he only won 38% in the general election. Part of it, so basically the short answer to that is yes, part of it is certainly the inflation. Part of it is that people question his cognitive abilities, rightly or wrongly. And I think the third factor is he was never a base candidate, meaning he was never somebody that, for example, like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was the candidate of the Democratic base. He was the candidate that the liberals really were attracted to. Joe Biden was the realistic candidate. He was for the people who said, we have to beat Donald Trump by any means necessary. And just like Jimmy Carter in 1976 won the nomination because the Democratic Party viewed him as somebody who could beat Gerald Ford, not necessarily their favorite candidate. By 1980, when he ran for re-election, Ted Kennedy and Jerry Brown ran for the base of the Democratic Party, and Jimmy Carter had only had support essentially in the center of the Democratic Party, and there's a lot more people on the left than there are in the center.
It's kind of disturbing to me that Bernie Sanders was the prime candidate of the Democratic base, because I don't think he's a very good candidate. For me, for my money, I'm not a big fan.
Well, the interesting thing about Bernie Sanders is this. Pete Buttigieg was running, and he was essentially under 40 years old, and his support was mostly from older Americans. He was not espousing the Democratic Socialist message. Bernie Sanders, in his late 70s, his support stemmed from very liberal, very young Americans who believe that the Democratic Party, if you listen to it, they believe the Democratic Party is too militarist, too bellicose. They believe that they're too corporatist. And Bernie Sanders became their tribune. He was the tribune of the left wing of the Democratic Party. But part of the reason he did not win the nomination, well, first, the fact that Elizabeth Warren was going for a lot of the same votes as was Tulsi Gabbard, but because Democrats were looking, they did not want somebody that was going to be ideologically rarefied. They wanted somebody that was going to be electable. So accordingly, a lot of Democrats said, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. I'm going to hold my nose and vote for him. And that's the problem Joe Biden has. Once Joe Biden gets elected, he does not have this base of support that will absolutely die for Joe Biden, like they would essentially, a lot of people, I think, would have died for Bernie Sanders.
So the war in Ukraine, does not that reposition how Democrats have to feel about a military budget? Nobody likes what the Russians are doing, right, except the Serbs and the
Bulgaria,
yeah. Well, I don't, not Bulgaria, but a couple other countries. Bulgaria, are they aligned with Russia?
They're one of the few. Countries. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, okay. So everybody's kind of glad that we have all these weapons to supply to Ukraine. And you start to say, oh, yeah, that's why we spend all that money on weapons, etc., on our military, because there really are bad people, bad organizations, bad countries that want to see us go down. And there's evidence of it. Doesn't that, have to kind of help Biden? It doesn't seem like it helped him that much. Why doesn't it help him more? And doesn't a winning Democratic candidate have to be a little more understanding of a big military budget?
First of all, I don't think that the Ukraine issue is going to be a primary factor in either the midterms or in the general election. Americans do not vote on foreign policy unless it's a direct war that the United States is involved in. I mean, that's certainly what destroyed Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam. and it certainly destroyed Harry Truman in Korea to the point that both of them could not run for re-election in 52 and 68 respectively. In terms of the military aid, there's actually been a lot of angst from the right wing of the Republican Party that say essentially, why are we sending money to the Ukraine when we should be spending that money at home?
Is that true? Is that true angst? That sounds like a Democratic thing. It sounds just political. I mean,
we're at the point
defending democracy is the right wing way, and why wouldn't they be on board except through a desire to bring down Biden and to diminish Biden?
This is the way. This is where Donald Trump. This is the Pat Buchanization of the Republican Party. Donald Trump's Republican Party is completely the opposite. Is completely transmogrified from the idea of George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, everybody else in terms of interventionist. What Donald Trump's essential position is, and this is the new position of the Republican Party. This is why folks like Newt Gingrich have essentially accommodated, even Lindsey Graham to some respect. The view of the Republican Party right now is essentially the view that the United States needs to take care of themselves, that the United States should not intervene militarily unless there's a direct threat to the United States. That is essentially how Donald Trump has changed the trajectory. Look at trade, for example. George W. Bush talked about how the United States needs to essentially open up more markets. Donald Trump says the opposite. We need to protect our industry here, so consequently, we're going to put tariffs up. This is the Donald Trump message of the Republican Party. Now, that being said, there's still the establishment wing of the party, folks like Mitch McConnell, who supported giving aid to the Ukrainians. But I think the Donald Trump message, and this is if you listen to it, Pat Buchanan was saying when he ran for president in 92, 96, and 2000, when it comes to issues of NATO, for example, he would say, why is the United States in this alliance? And Donald Trump has very much questioned that. Why, for example, if a country like, any former Soviet republic, if let's say the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary were to be invaded, why should the United States have to essentially come to their aid and send American boys and girls over there to fight a war that they should be fighting for themselves? That is the new conservatism. That is the new conservative position. It's almost like see the old boss same. It's same as the new boss, same as the old boss. This is the Calvin Coolidge wing of the Republican Party. The interventionist wing of the Republican Party is now considered establishment. And I'll tell you, if Mitch McConnell gets up and speaks at the Heritage Foundation or any conservative organization and a Trump rally, Kevin McCarthy, anyone else, and says, we need to support the Ukrainians, they're probably going to get booed because the party has changed so much.
Oh, yeah. The other country I was looking for was Belarusia.
Oh,
is
that
what you were thinking of too?
I meant Belarus. That's what I meant.
Yeah, right.
I was saying, I think I said Bulgaria. I was like, yeah.
Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of stuff that I didn't plan to cover. Oh, one more question that is not related to what I plan to cover, and that is, tell me about the January 6th hearings coming up and how that might affect things. Not at all.
Very little. Obviously, it's bad press for Donald Trump, but what it really does on both sides is it galvanizes the base for the left to say, look what happened on January 6th, and it galvanizes the base on the right to say, look at this conspiracy that the liberals are essentially effectuating toward us. But generally speaking, the people that are going to vote on the January 6th are already going to vote, and we already know essentially the way they're going to vote. In terms of the votes that actually matter, it's going to be, I think, a referendum on the state of the economic affairs, on the economy, unless the United States is somehow involved in a major war. And that's what people generally, unless there's a war that the United States is directly involved in. By that I mean boots on the ground. The economy and the state of the current president is probably going to be the preponderance of what most folks that are in the center anyways are going to actually vote for, most swing or showdown state voters.
I lied. One more question before we get to some trivia. How do you feel that President Biden is handling the Ukraine situation? And to narrow down on that, how about the sending of the long-range missiles versus not sending them? That's a tough tightrope to walk, because you want to be seen as strong by China and potential future aggressors, and by Putin. and you want to help out the Ukrainians, but you don't want to give the Ukrainians missiles that could make it into Russia. And so that's a tightrope to walk. And he said no, and then he said yes, but I'm not sure that these are the same missiles. I think the others might have been long range, and these are moderate range, 80 kilometers. I don't know. But how do you think Biden's doing on Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the tightrope. This is the same one that Franklin Roosevelt walked prior to World War II when he supported the Lend-Lease program, aiding Britain without directly sending military troops that could be involved in the World War II. Eventually, Pearl Harbor occurred in 1941, and the United States was forced to actually send troops and involve themselves in the war. But one thing Joe Biden has done is that he has avoided the United States entangling by putting ground troops in or by enforcing a no-fly zone. There are some people, it's kind of weird now, it's kind of on the left and kind of the center now, who say that yes, we should enforce a no-fly zone. If the United States were to enforce a no-fly zone, does that mean that they'll be shooting at Russian planes? And if you shoot at Russian planes, then that means essentially there's a world war because Russia's going to be fighting back, and the United States in a military conflict with Russia. And Joe Biden knows that. He's doing everything I think he possibly can for the Ukrainians without actually getting involved in a war. And I do think that one of the fears that the right now has about NATO and bringing in countries like Sweden and Finland is that the more that the United States you're galvanizing the Russia, you're effectuating angst, you're creating angst with Russia, saying, why on all these former countries are you now aligning yourselves with NATO? That another possibility for a world war would be, what if Russia were to go in and say, all right, we're going to challenge you. We're actually going to go into a NATO country. What if they say, you know what? We're going to go into Poland. We're going to go into a NATO country and we're going to invade. Then the United States and every other NATO member, except Iceland because you don't have a military, is going to actually come in and send in troops. And then, folks, we have World War III. This is such a tight balance. This is such a tight balancing act. But if you get what the Ukrainian president wants and you actually enforce a no-fly zone and Vladimir Putin actually challenges that, then we're in World War III.
So interesting thing about a no-fly zone. You can kind of enforce a no-fly zone, not from the air, but from the ground with the new weapons. Things are changing. It's pretty interesting. And I'm excited about that. These cheap missiles can be held by a single guy that weighs 50 pounds, can take down a Russian jet. That they are a lot more hesitant to use those jets. So there's that.
Well, also, I just want to say the United States did very similar strategy, what we did in Afghanistan the first time when essentially President Carter approved sending missiles or sending military technology to the Arab Afghan Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, but they did not directly necessarily involve themselves. But they brought in so much military technology, and it landed up actually helping them. And this war went on, till 1987, and was one of the reasons why the Russians lost the Cold War.
If I were the boss, I think I would drag out the entrance of Finland and Sweden into NATO. And I would also, this is bad for the Ukrainians, but if you played it right, just big picture, you could make Ukraine be Russia's new Afghanistan, and it killed them once and it could kill them again. It could just bleed them dry. And if you do the energy ban, the EU energy ban, they're just going to break. They will not be able to keep a strong army. Their society will break down. By the way, one interesting thing.
Yes.
Speaking of sanctions, I did see a video on YouTube, and at first I thought, "Oh, this is a Ukrainian sympathizer who's doing a video in Russia to show the conditions of the stores in the market." But as I watched it, I realized I think that it was Russian propaganda, because it was a woman, a very attractive woman, and a very high quality production. And at first the woman said that, I don't care. I'm going to go and show you the way it is, even though I could get in trouble for it. But she had unlimited time in the marketplace. She wasn't ducking around the corners. She was doing it right out in the open. And she was trying to tell us, how showing how beautiful everything is in the stores and how the prices are down. And just if anybody watching this, be careful of what you see on TV because the camera does lie. All right, let's get into your book and some trivia. Tell me about some funny things that happened on the campaign trails of the past. And once again, this comes from Rich Rubino's book called, and I can never remember this, it is the Great American Political Trivia book. Political Trivia book. There you go.
Political Trivia Challenge, yes.
Challenge, that's right. Okay.
Political Trivia on steroids.
Yeah.
And what's absolutely fascinating is the effect that the 1840 presidential election has had on pretty much every presidential campaign since. It was the first modern presidential campaign. And here's how it happened. William Henry Harrison, former general, military hero, was running, and he was 67 years old. So a newspaper correspondent under the alias of Z wrote at the time that what we really need to do for William Henry Harrison is give him a pension of $2,000, give him a bottle of whiskey, and have him sit on the porch of his log cabin, and he's going to read moral philosophy all day, and we won't have to deal with him. So the handlers for William Henry Harrison came up with this great idea. The fact that William Henry Harrison was a patrician, his father was governor of Virginia, signer of the Declaration of Independence, let's make him into a populist. Let's make into him a log cabin candidate. Accordingly, they came up with this idea that he would essentially, that he was going to be the log cabin candidate, even though he only lived in a log cabin very briefly after he was in the military. And there was a guy named Booze, and he created these interesting bottles, and they were shaped like log cabins with whiskey in them, and that's where the name Booze came from, because E.G. Booze decided to promote William Henry Harrison that way. So Harrison, he would dress down in public, and he would pretend that he was essentially some sort of a rube, and people absolutely loved it. They thought, this is the president we need. Now, when he was running, one of the things William Sword, the former governor of New York, always used to say, that essentially the best way to get a crowd is essentially to already have a crowd. So how do you make crowds of William Henry Harrison rallies interesting? So a supporter from Zanesville, Ohio, comes up with the idea, why don't we have a ball, and we'll roll the ball from town to town, from rally to rally. So that's where the slogan, keep the ball rolling, came from.
Oh my God.
They would roll balls in all these rallies, and people would say it's kind of like going to a baseball game when people have these beach balls. All of a sudden, people are saying, I want to go around and roll the ball too. So now people are saying, I want to go to the William Henry Harrison rallies. Now, on the other side of that, his opponent was Martin Van Buren. And here's Martin Van Buren's contribution to that. First of all, Martin Van Buren, by the way, was a Democrat, but back then the Democrats were the conservative party. And in 1837, there was a panic of 1837, a Great Depression, and Martin Van Buren was so trepidatious about sending military. I'm going back to Ukraine now. About trying to stimulate the economy in terms of public works projects, that he literally sold the government tools so they could not be used for that. He becomes extremely unpopular. He was from Kinderhook, New York, and he would sign his papers OK. So eventually, there were OK clubs that formed for people who supported Martin Van Buren, and that's part of the reason we have the word OK in the American lexicon. This all came from this 1840 presidential campaign between William Henry Harrison and Martin Van Buren. And despite all that, William Henry Harrison gets elected, he gets sick, and he dies 31 days into his term. So his basic legacy was actually running for president. Oh, and by the way, he was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. And his vice presidential candidate for the Whig Party that year was John Tyler. So their slogan was, where's the motion, where's the commotion? Keep the ball rolling for Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Man, so that's three big ones. Booze, keep the ball rolling, and what was the other one?
Okay.
Back to the booze. Can you? I need to tell other people this, and I want to make sure I get it right. Give me the quick version of the booze. There's a man named Booze that put these bottles together and filled them with alcohol.
Yeah, and he made him look like a log cabin because
look like a log cabin.
Was the log cabin candidate.
All right. Wow. That's good stuff. Really, I love word origins and I love phrase origins. Got any more?
Well, I do have an interesting story. Do you remember Fred Harris?
Fred Harris.
Ran for president in 1972, 1976.
Nope.
Couple words came from him. He was a populist. First of all, In Iowa, the slogan is "you're winnowed out," meaning essentially if you don't come in the top 4, you're winnowed out. You don't get to go into New Hampshire.
Yeah.
So Fred Harris comes in 4th place. He wasn't supposed to, and he's interviewed and he says, "I've just been winnowed in." So the next day, people say the slogan. People look at the front page and it's that he's been essentially winnowed in. And here's an interesting story that he used to tell. There was a supporter of his in Massachusetts. The cab drivers were all supporting of him. So accordingly, one of his aides is in a cab and he sees this little trinket. It says "cab drivers for Fred Harris." And he says, "Who's Fred Harris?" He said, "Oh, he's running for president." He says, "A good guy?" He said, "Yeah, he's a good guy." He says, "Where's he from?" He says, "Oklahoma." Then the guy in the back, pretending not to know where Oklahoma was, looked at him and said, "Well, where is Oklahoma?" The guy gets all confused, all flustered, and says, "Well, I think if you go west on Commonwealth Avenue over there." And he also had he was a state senator and he was running for re-election at one point. And he comes up to a supporter and he says, "I'm Fred Harris and I'm running for state senate," without saying he's incumbent. The guy says, "You know what, son, I'm going to support you." And he says, "Why?" He says, "Because anything we do to get that bastard we got on there now out of office." So he was very interesting. That was a fascinating campaign, by the way. Jimmy Carter would win primaries, but he'd barely win them against Mo Udall. And the Wisconsin Sentinel one time actually had a headline that Mo Udall ekes out a victory against Jimmy Carter. They didn't count all the late returns, and the late returns, Mo Udall actually lost to Jimmy Carter. This gave him the nickname of second place Mo, because he would come in second place everywhere. But he had a great wit to himself, and he was in a he was running one time for the chairman of the Democratic caucus. And back then, or still today, it's all essentially a secret ballot. So people told a majority of the caucus members told him that he was going to win. And he went in there thinking he was going to win, then he lost. And accordingly, after that, he said, "The only difference, you know what the difference is between a cactus and a caucus?" He said, on a cactus, the pricks are on the outside.
That's a good one.
And I'll give you one more story about him. He was in New Hampshire, and he walked into a barber shop. He introduced himself to the barber. He said, "Hi," he says, "I just want to say I'm Mo Udall and I'm running for president." The barber looks at him and says, "Yeah, we were just laughing about that yesterday."
Well, you are a fantastic guest. I got to admit, we went way beyond the initial plan, and we talked a lot about politics. 4 more minutes. Local politics.
Yes.
The auditor's position in Massachusetts. That's a super important position. And Chris Dempsey, the guy who saved Massachusetts and particularly Boston from the Olympics, is running for state auditor.
Yep.
Do you think is that in the bag for him? Is that going to be a struggle?
I don't.
The incumbent has endorsed him.
Yep, Suzanne Bump. My guess is he's certainly the preponderant front runner for the Democratic nomination. I will say if he gets to the general election on the Republican side, Doug Moore, the one person who Charlie Baker has actually supported for a Republican candidate. He hasn't supported Republicans anywhere. He didn't even go to the convention where Jeff Deal essentially won the endorsement of the convention. That is one thing where I think the entire Baker machine will put in as much support as they potentially can. I think they want to have at least one statewide office. They want to have some candidate for if the Republican Party implodes in this gubernatorial election, somebody in the wings for 2026. So that's something that I actually think that's the one office the Republicans probably have somewhat of a chance at. But that being said, state auditor, so much of that election is name recognition anyways. I don't think a lot of people actually go to the polls looking at what everyone did, whether what they did in the state Senate, what they've done to become state auditor. Most people look at it as more or less a position whereby somebody is looking to use that to become lieutenant governor, to become governor, to become something else. But it's always interesting when you have a state auditor debate, how many people will actually watch it, because how many people actually either know what a state auditor does and if they do know what a state auditor does, how many people actually follow the different policy prescriptions that each candidate is offering the people.
The way I look at it, a state auditor prevents the state for us from getting ripped off.
I just don't think most people in their daily lives don't follow any other than the governor. I don't think most people know what the Secretary of State is, who's running for Secretary of State, what a lieutenant governor does. They just want to look kind of at the top of the ticket. And the gubernatorial race obviously will garner a lot of attention. People kind of know what a governor does, United States senator, congressman. Generally speaking, the down ballot offices garner very little support, garner very little attention. And that's why so much of it is trying to convince people to actually go to the polls. And obviously some of it on the Democratic side, their big advantage is, and this certainly helps Mr. Dempsey, is if he wins, assuming if he actually wins the nomination, is in the general election, there'll be a lot more Democrats or independents with Democrat leanings who are going to be just flipping the Democrat switch rather than the Republican switch. And that's something that certainly will hurt Baker and his team that are trying to elevate at least one person to statewide office in Massachusetts.
Rich Rubino, you're the best, and you got a bunch of books, and everyone should buy them all. I'm out of time. We're at 45 minutes. I'm surprised this thing hasn't shut me down now.
Wow.
So if we go 45 minutes, you know that you're awesome. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I greatly enjoyed it. Anytime.
Talk to you soon. And make sure everyone, if you want to do me a favor and Rich a favor and yourself a favor, share these. This is live, but it stays on the social media platforms. It's streamed. By the way, Rich is streamed live to Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And anyone they stay up there. And if you'll share them, it's a big help for everybody. Thanks. Take care, Rich.
Thank you so much. Thank you, you too.
Okay.